Good afternoon, and welcome to this press conference following the Foreign Affairs Council Development Ministers format. The HRVP will brief you of the outcome of this meeting, and then we have the time for just a few questions. So, HRVP Borrell, you have the floor.
Thank you. The development ministers met today with two items on the agenda. The first one was the global food security crisis, and the second one was a meeting with Filippo Grandi to study the situation of the refugees around the world, not only from Ukraine, also from Ukraine, but without forgetting other refugee crises in which the European Union supporting the High Commissioner for Refugees. The first was the discussion among ministers on the looming global food security crisis. It was also a market of food under stress before the war. But after the Russian attack against Ukraine, this crisis is becoming much worse, and today it endangers the food security of millions of people in many parts of the world. The Russian troops are bombing Ukrainian fields, not allowing the sowing of the crops, looting food stocks, blocking Ukrainian ports, and so increasing price for food and fertilizers. They have skyrocketed in many parts of the world. So the world's food supply is in danger, mainly due to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And the numbers speak for themselves. Last year, 2021, Russia and Ukraine were among the top exporters of cereals and sunflower seeds and oil with Ukraine, and these were accounting about 50% of world trade of sunflowers. Just to put an example, sunflower oil, 50% coming from Ukraine. And Russia is occupying or shelling parts of the arable Ukrainian land, and it is estimated that almost half of the winter wheat, almost 40% of rye, and more than 60% of corn to be harvested in summer 22 is situated in zones that are at risk. So these future crops will also be on risk. 20%, 30% of the areas on the winter cereal, maize and sunflower seed production in Ukraine will either remain unharvested or not be planted this spring. This to give an idea of how much the Ukrainian agricultural capacity will be damaged by the war. The consequence is that food is missing and will be missing. And when it's not missing, it is expensive, much more expensive than many people can afford. If we spend more resources on food, they have less for education and health, and this will deepening poverty and inequalities. It's clear that the first victims will be vulnerable population around the world, particularly in low-income countries who depend on food and fertilizers imports. As I said, the situation was already very bad before the war. It was an estimated 193 million people in 53 countries were facing acute food insecurity. And you have a look at the figures, especially in the Horn of Africa, of the people who can die from starvation in Ethiopia, in particular, and all the Horn of Africa. The figures are really terrifying. But now the war has turned it into a full crisis, and the need for a global response from the global community has been at the debate today with the ministers. We have already made a two-pledging conference to support the population in the Sahel and Lake Chad region, and the other on the Horn of Africa. And the European Union, with its Team Europe approach, has made important pledges to these two conferences. We have to look for additional money, and for that we need a Team Europe approach, calling for the budgets of the member states to be mobilized, because you know that the budget of the European Union cannot have deficit. So we can redirect, reschedule, reorient our resources, but it is an approach of the member states altogether that the solution can be found. Today we discuss about solidarity, emergency relief, to work on food affordability and macroeconomic stability. We work on how to boost production. We will support over 70 partners in boosting output and resilience and sustainability of their food systems to increase their food capacity in the medium term. Third, on trade, there are around 20 million tons of grains in the Ukrainian silos. They are blocked by Putin war. There are a lot of ships waiting to load this grain, and they cannot do it because the Russian Navy is blocking the Ukrainian ports. That's why we are trying to look for alternative ways of taking these grains to the people. We are at the Commission prepared this proposal for solidarity lanes. We call for the member states to implement it quickly. And we call also to our partners not to restrict global trade of agricultural products and inputs. And finally, to work on a multilateral basis with United Nations, the G7, the Food and Agriculture Resilience Missions Initiative, and others that could gather the efforts of everybody. We are very much aware that after the mass diplomacy, remember the beginning of the COVID, and then the vaccine diplomacy, now we are entering into a period of food diplomacy. And we have to fight in a new additional battle of narrative to counter the Russia disinformation machine that tries to convince the world that the rise in price of food is a consequence of the sanctions imposed on Russia. By the contrary, this is not the sanctions. This is a false claim from Russia. It is the war itself which is producing this food crisis and its high price increases. Our sanctions do not counter food, do not counter agricultural products, do not counter fertilizers. We don't prevent Russian exports on these things because we knew that they could affect the world market on food and fertilizers. This has to be clear because the Russians insist once and again the price spike is consequences of the West sanctions against us. No. The tensions in the markets are consequences of the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. But we have to do more than to try to explain it. We have to present a plan in order to deal with the geopolitical consequences of this war, and we'll do it on the next Foreign Affairs Council in June, and I am sure the European Union Council will also deal with that on the next meeting. After this exchange on the food insecurity crisis, we had the opportunity to exchange with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi. It was the first time that Filippo was coming to the Foreign Affairs Council on the development formation. We had, thanks to him, an overview of the global situation on refugees around the world. 1 year ago, there were 84 million forcibly displaced persons. According with the last data that Filippo Grandi explained to us, we are reaching the red line of 100 million people forced to leave their homes, displaced around the world for many different reasons, from climate change to political instability, from war to hunger. 100 million people is more than the population of Germany. This is the population of Egypt. United Nations High Council for Refugees is a key partner for us, for the European Union, and for the member states also. We are the second largest donor to UNHCR, and we have seen how humanitarian needs they are at all-time high. The needs are growing much quicker than the generosity. Already in February this year, they were high, at the peak. And then came the Ukrainian war and had 6 million refugees out of the Ukrainian border and 7-8 million inside Ukrainians. So this is why we are reaching the 100 million people. And everybody is looking at the refugees coming from Ukraine, at least in the European perspective. But the situation is not improving, but the contrary is worsening in many places of the world, as Filippo has explained to us, from Afghanistan to Myanmar to the Horn of Africa. The amount of needs is increasing, and this will put a strong strain on our capacity to continue supporting financially these people. This will require, once again, to work on a joint Team Euro response. The consequences of this situation has to be faced by the European Union budget, but also and mainly from the European Union member states. The gap between the available resources will continue to expand. We must step up our efforts to shrink the needs and to become more efficient in delivering aid. But there is a strong need to scale up the resources available. And that we have been discussing today with a lot of preoccupation, because we know that this situation can create political instability and turmoil. And not to pay the price today of avoiding this crisis can come with a higher price tomorrow if this crisis develops. The ministers went out to the meeting very much aware of the situation and committed to act.
Thanks a lot, and we have the time for a couple of questions. I will start with you in the room, because you asked quite a few questions earlier, but you will start. You first, and then you, and then you.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. My first question is, there are efforts ongoing at the UN to create special corridors, humanitarian corridors, to export more of the grain that's stuck in Ukraine. But Russia obviously would need to be party to that agreement. Can you see that it would be realistic that the EU would agree to such a deal with Russia to get out the grain from Ukraine? And secondly, there is a real proliferation of international efforts now to deal with food security. There's the French Farm Initiative, there's the Global Alliance for Food Security from Germany and the G7. Is there a risk that a lot of these initiatives are going to counteract each other and there won't really be enough coordination? And should the EU step in and play more of a stronger coordinating role? Thanks.
Sí, gracias. Tratamos de hacerlo. Tratamos de asegurar una mayor coordinación, primero y antes que nada, entre nosotros mismos, que no es poco trabajo. Es decir, Team Europe no tiene poderes mágicos. Es una invocación que tiene que ir seguida de acciones concretas. Sin duda hay que coordinar mejor las iniciativas, pero dejemos que surjan iniciativas, dejemos que surjan. Son maneras de canalizar la preocupación, las inquietudes y los recursos. La coordinación tiene que seguir, pero no es una mala cosa que surjan distintas iniciativas, como la impulsada por la presidencia francesa, o las Naciones Unidas, o los Estados Unidos. Bienvenidos sean, después habrá que intentar que trabajen de una forma coordinada. Sobre los corredores humanitarios, bueno, realmente no estamos hablando de corredores humanitarios, estamos hablando de corredores de transporte, de sistemas de transporte. No estamos transportando seres humanos, estamos transportando una mercancía tan elemental como es el girasol o el trigo. Necesitamos el acuerdo de Rusia si se trata de pasar por territorios bajo control ruso. Por supuesto, si hay que desbloquear los puertos de la Mar Negra ucranianos, hará falta el acuerdo ruso. Pero no olvidemos que estas aguas están muy minadas, llenas de minas, que en parte están allí como medida defensiva por parte de Ucrania y en parte como medida de bloqueo por parte de Rusia. Por lo tanto, no es una tarea fácil. Si se trata de hacer pasar los corredores de transporte por territorios en los que Rusia no tiene control, no lo necesitamos para nada. Y en este momento la intención es intentar enlazar otros puertos del Mar Negro, en las costas de países miembros de la Unión Europea, que puedan ser accesibles por tren desde Ucrania. Solamente si consiguiésemos reducir el tiempo que tarda hoy un tren cargado de trigo a alcanzar un puerto de la costa europea del Mar Negro, si consiguiéramos reducir eso, que actualmente es del orden de las 16 semanas, a todas luces fuera de todo estándar razonable, ya conseguiríamos hacer mucho.
You have the floor.
Buenas tardes. Sí, ¿me siente? Buenas tardes, alto representante. Soy Tommaso Lecca de la agencia de prensa italiana AGI. Tengo una primera pregunta sobre la propuesta italiana para llegar a un acuerdo de paz en Ucrania. Esta propuesta que ha sido presentada a la mesa de las Naciones Unidas incluye también la neutralidad de Ucrania y de unas partes de unas regiones de Ucrania. Y me gustaría saber si usted piensa que esta puede ser la solución para terminar el conflicto. Y una segunda pregunta sobre una noticia que acaba de llegar, no sé si usted ya lo sabe, pero han sido secuestrados 3 italianos en Mali. ¿Tiene un comentario sobre esto y si tiene noticias que puede decirnos? Muchas gracias.
He tomado nota del anuncio por parte de nuestro colega italiano de un plan de paz presentado por Italia al secretario general el pasado 19 de mayo. Nosotros desde la Unión Europea apoyamos todos los esfuerzos para intentar conseguir el final del conflicto, pero eso, desde la perspectiva europea, pasa por la inmediata alto de la agresión y la retirada incondicional de las tropas rusas fuera del territorio de Ucrania. Y las condiciones para este alto el fuego es Ucrania quien las tiene que decidir. Nosotros ahora, a nivel de la Unión Europea, tratamos de apoyar a Ucrania. Hacemos todos los esfuerzos diplomáticos para llegar a un alto el fuego, pero también queremos que cuando las negociaciones tengan lugar, que en algún momento tendrán lugar, Ucrania llegue a las mismas en una posición de fuerza. Y hago una llamada para que los europeos mantengamos la unidad en todos los frentes diplomáticos y militares en lo que respecta a la agresión de Rusia contra Ucrania.
On Mali, but I'm not sure we got the. Do you have?
Sí.
Have you seen it?
No tenemos más información de la que ya tuve ocasión de comentar después del Consejo de Ministros de Defensa. Vamos a presentar un plan para una disminución ordenada y un redimensionamiento de nuestra misión en Mali. Hemos decidido suspender las actividades de formación de tropa y no veo una perspectiva para que podamos reemprenderlas en un futuro próximo. Por lo tanto, hay que disminuir los efectivos, hay que hacerlo de forma coordinada, una vez más, ¿no? Que todo el mundo presente sus planes de retirada por su cuenta. Tenemos que redesplegar los efectivos en otros países de la región y tenemos que ver de qué manera los objetivos de la misión pueden ser redefinidos para seguir ayudando a la población de Mali. Pero las actividades de formación de tropa, las que piden muchos efectivos, teníamos ahora casi 1000, esas ya no van a requerir tantos efectivos y por lo tanto tendrán que disminuirse. Y lo que he pedido a los Estados miembros es que lo hagamos de una forma coordinada y evitar iniciativas autónomas que no pueden sino contribuir a dificultar una tarea colectiva.
We're running out of time, so Vince, you have the last question. I see that David doesn't have a question anymore, right? Vince, please.
Yes, thank you. Vince Chadwick from DevEx. Commissioner Urpilainen told the Development Committee on Monday that preserving funds for African countries is now her #1 priority in the light of the Ukraine conflict and the needs and the pressure that's going to come on the EU budget from that conflict. I'm aware that the commitments made to African partners at the summit in February was also based on the understanding that member states would contribute a large part of the funding. But I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about the Commission funding. Can you guarantee that when it comes to EU budget amounts, that the amounts that were programmed and have been carefully planned for African partners will be maintained and will not be cut or reallocated as we've seen in Sweden and Norway and other countries? Thank you.
Sin duda, África sigue siendo una prioridad para Europa. Es, geopolíticamente hablando, la gran prioridad. Y la guerra en Ucrania, que no estaba anunciada ni prevista, ciertamente nos va a obligar a canalizar fondos a Ucrania, lo estamos haciendo, y a los países vecinos de Ucrania que están recibiendo nada más y nada menos que 6 millones de personas. Pero esto no se está haciendo en detrimento de los fondos que habían sido asignados a África. Otra cosa es que dentro de las envolventes financieras destinadas a África se prioricen de forma diferente los objetivos, como ya lo hicimos cuando al llegar la pandemia dimos prioridad a fortalecer los sistemas sanitarios. En vez de construir carreteras, desarrollamos el sistema sanitario. Y ahora seguramente habrá objetivos que dejarán de ser prioritarios porque dar de comer a la población será más prioritario todavía. Pero dentro de una reestructuración de las envolventes sectoriales no va a haber disminución de nuestra aportación a África.
Okay, this closes our press conference for today. Thank you, High Representative. Thank you all for your patience, and thanks a lot to the interpreters. Thank you.